Welcome to the Synthesis of Yoga, the book that changed my life. We are reading Sri Aurobindo's The Synthesis of Yoga. We have reached part 1, 7th chapter, Codes of Conduct and Spiritual Freedom. For those who are new, we are reading line by line to really get into Sri Aurobindo's consciousness. When a master yogi sees the reality from that yogi consciousness, it is from there the words come. And these words and their rhythms, lines, carry that consciousness. While reading line by line, going with its rhythm and flow, we are coming in touch with that consciousness, internalizing it, getting it imprinted within us. There is a link in the description where you can find this chapter. So follow us. And in the last episode, which was episode 92, Sri Aurobindo gave us the indication of 4 levels of codes of conduct, an ascending scale: individual, collective, ethical, and spiritual, of which he took up first and 2. And he also showed us how the individual and collective are mutually dependent. On one hand, the collective outlasts the individual because individual's lifespan is shorter than the collective. Collectivity has its own mind and life. Individual has one's own mind and life. And even though collectivity outlives the individual still carry within him spark of the eternal, the soul within. That makes the very presence of that individual in the collectivity all the more important. That's a saving element in the individual. And there is a relationship between the two, a strong interdependency between the individual and the collective. Now let's move on to new episode. We are starting with paragraph number 11. This is episode 93. In itself, this seemingly larger and overriding law, that is the law of the collective, is no more than an extension of the vital and animal principle that governs the individual elementary man. Collectivity is composed of the individual, and individual elementary man is governed by vital and animal principles, because our evolutionary past, that's our legacy software running us. Evolutionary psychology, it is there within us. That basic need, survival, basic need-based consciousness is what is animating the vital and animal principle with all its eating, mating, sleeping, reproducing, surviving, propagating. These are the basic drives upon which it is built. It is the law of the pack or herd. So this social law is essentially law of the pack, the herd of which you are a part. The individual identifies partially, not fully, partially, his life with the life of a certain number of other individuals with whom he is associated by birth, choice, or circumstance. So we have an identification with our parents, siblings, family, network of friends, organizations where we have spent decades or years, or a specific social context, geographical context where we are born and brought up. There is an identification, sense of belonging. And this is very common. This is something very natural. And there is a partial identification. It's not entire identification, but partial. So the individual identifies partially his life with the life of a certain number of other individuals. So we do have this network of connections, biological connections, connection through work, connection through context, geography. So there is a certain identification there with a certain number of people with whom he is associated by birth, choice, or circumstance. And since the existence of the group is necessary for his own existence and satisfaction, so individual's existence and satisfaction very much depends upon the group. In times, if not from the first, its preservation, the fulfillment of its needs, the satisfaction of its collective notions, desires, habits of living, without which it would not hold together, must come to take a primary place. So the needs of the collectivity of which you are a part come to play an important role in your own way of looking at governing your actions. So there is a preservation of the collectivity to which you belong to, a fulfillment of its needs, and the satisfaction of its collective notions. Every group, collectivity has their own notion of what is a good life, what it means to grow, what it means to progress, what is a noble life, what is success, what is failure, what is important, what is not important. All these notions we inherit from that collective being. It has its desires, it has its habits of living. We naturally internalize all this. Food habits, dressing habits, cultural habits, all that become part of it and become part of our code of conduct, without which it would not hold together. The collectivity is held together by these notions, desires, habits of living. That gives its identity. This is a cultural grouping, a regional grouping, an organizational entity that has its own specific notions, desires, habits of living. So therefore, they come to take a primary place in the consciousness of the individual. Let's read this line fully. And since the existence of the group is necessary for his own existence and satisfaction, in time, if not from the first, the preservation, the fulfillment of its needs, and the satisfaction of its collective notions, desires, habits of living, without which it would not hold together, must come to take a primary role. The satisfaction of personal idea and feeling. Personal idea and feeling. Every individual has their own personal ideas and feeling, need and desire, propensity and habit has to be constantly subordinated. So whatever be your personal idea and feeling, need and desire, propensity and habit, they are to be subordinated to the collectivity by the necessity of the situation and not from any moral or altruistic motive. So it is the necessity of the situation because you find yourself in a situation of being embedded into a group consciousness. So it's not because of any moral or altruistic motive you conform yourself to the group and try to fulfill its needs. It is a necessity created by the very fact of being born and brought up in a particular context. So by the necessity of the situation and not from any moral or altruistic motive, to the satisfaction of the ideas and feelings, needs and desires, propensities and habits. So it is exactly the same set. Individual has ideas and feelings, needs and desires, propensity and habit. Same way, the collectivity has ideas and feelings, needs and desires, propensities and habits. Not of this or that other individual or number of individuals, but of the society as a whole. So it's not few individuals of the society, but the pack, the herd, the collective being. It is that having this well-formed collective, regulatory, written or unwritten codes of conduct to which you submit yourself to. That's part of that process. So the satisfaction of personal idea and feeling, need and desire, propensity and habit has to be constantly subordinated. It is a constant subordination by the necessity of the situation and not from any moral or altruistic motive to the satisfaction of the ideas and feelings, needs and desires, propensities and habits, not this or that other individual or number of individuals, but of the society as a whole. This social need is the obscure matrix of morality and of man's ethical impulse. There is an ethical impulse in man. There is also a sense of morality in man. But all that comes from this social need is the obscure matrix. The obscure matrix of the social need. From there comes the morality as well as ethical impulse. Morality will tell you what is good, what is bad. Generally, religions teach morality, customs, traditions. Then there is an ethical impulse where more intellectual, philosophical perspectives define codes of conduct. It is not actually known that in any primitive times man lived in himself or with only his mate as do some of the animals. So historically it is not known that man has lived for himself alone or for his mate. Some animals may do, but not man. That had been not historically evident. All record of him shows him to us as a social animal, not an isolated body and spirit. We are social beings, a social animal. There is a herd of which we are a part. Though we would love to fantasize and imagine ourselves to be independent, yet we belong to herd. When our particular grouping is criticized, you get hurt because there is an identification with the herd, with the group. All record of him, the historic records, show him to us as a social animal, not an isolated body and spirit. So the individual body and spirit actually find itself to be part of a group consciousness. The law of the pack has always overridden his individual law of self-development. There is an individual law of self-development. But this law, driven by one's own individual needs and desires, gets overridden by the law of the pack. So, people personally, gladly sacrifice their personal needs for the welfare of the family, for the group they belong to. And this is very common in human beings. Now, the scale of that group can go all the way to the nation states. Like, for example, freedom of India last century. So, thousands of people gave their lives, sacrificed their lives for the welfare of and liberation of the nation. Similarly, now, the whole planet has become our sense of awareness, and protecting the planet, its ecosystem, that has become a concern, and many people give their life for that. If you override your personal concerns. Take, for example, veganism. Your compassion for the animals will define the food choices that you make. So it's not about my personal need and desire, it is about the larger ecosystem, larger grouping of which you are a part. So the law of the pack has always overridden his individual law of self-development. So this law of the pack is not really at the global level, not even at a national level, but your immediate pack social grouping of which you are a part. That is where our early stages of development begins. We are so identified with that group, and the law of the pack has always overridden. He seems always to have been born, to have lived, to have been formed as a unit in a mass. So the individual is born into a group and live in a group and is formed by the group. And you find yourself as a unit of a mass. There is a mass consciousness to which you belong to, you identify with. Yet another brick in the wall, the good old song. You find yourself to be just another brick on the wall. It is pre-individualization. Before the individual ego has developed, you are part of a group ego identified with it. Mass consciousness is the identity. So the law of the pack has always overridden his individual law of self-development. He seems always to have been born, to have lived, to have been formed as a unit in a mass. But logically and naturally, from the psychological viewpoint is the viewpoint from our interior. The law of personal need and desire is primary. The social law comes in as a secondary and usurping power. Naturally and logically, from a psychological viewpoint, the individual's personal need and desire is primary. Social law comes as a secondary and usurping power, something that is overriding what is primary there within you as a drive. Man has in him two distinct master impulses. We have many impulses within us. Biological instincts and drives, and impulsively that is coming up and going. Out of that, there are two master impulses that are underlying. One is the individualistic, other is the communal. The individualistic and the communal, the personal life and the social life, the personal motive of conduct and the social motive of conduct. So these two motives are simultaneously exist within us. To support the collective of which you are a part and to support one's own personal journey. But it has to find the right balance between the individual liberty and the collective harmony. So there is a creative tension between the two. So the man has in him two distinct master impulses, the individualistic and communal. So there is a need to differentiate yourself from the rest, on one hand. On the other hand, there is a need to identify yourself with the rest. So these two conflicting tendencies, master impulses, the individualistic and communal, personal life and social life, a personal motive of conduct and a social motive of conduct. These two master impulses constantly are playing through us. On one hand, we want to have that time and space to be free and explore your own freedom and discoveries. But then whatever you have discovered, you want the society to accept, love you, honor you, and belong to the collectivity that fulfills. So these two go together. The possibility of their opposition and the attempt to find their equation lie at the very roots of human civilization and persist in other figures when he has passed beyond the vital animal into the highly individualized mental and spiritual progress. So the opposition between these two master impulses, individualistic and communal, these two always try to find their equation, how to find the right balance between these two opposing tendencies. And that had been the very root of human civilization, where settlements and cities emerged with its own codes of conduct, laws of governance, where individual freedom and collective harmony has to find the right balance. Through that, customs, traditions, rules, regulations, cultures emerged. So that had been the very root of human civilization and persists in other figures when he has passed beyond vital animal. So when there is a vital animal, basic impulses driven life, vital life, physical vital life, when you go beyond it, even when you go beyond these tendencies still persist, even when you become highly individualized mental and spiritual person, still these two will still come together. There is a balance to be found. So when he has passed beyond the vital animal into the highly individualized mental and spiritual progress. So the modern society with the age of reason is highly into the mental development. And we are about to enter or beginning to enter or already slightly entered into the spiritual age. Individuals have already entered. In spite of that, there are these two things, individual and collective, trying to find its equation, the right balance. The existence of a social law external to the individual is at different times a considerable advantage and a heavy disadvantage to the development of the divine in man. So, the existence of social law, it is of great advantage, considerable advantage at a certain time of your growth. You need that law, its protection, the safety it provides, the identity it provides, the belonging it provides. You need it. But other times it becomes a heavy disadvantage to the development of the divine in man. When the inner calling touches, your soul wakes up. You find yourself to be yoked into these social institutions, whether it is family, marriage, work, money. These are all social institutions with its own laws and regulations. You find yourself to be yoked and bound by these institutional structures, its codes of conduct. Though they were of great advantage in your evolution till that point, but when the soul awakens and wants to liberate itself, you find yourself at a great disadvantage because these ropes binds you. So the existence of a social law external to the individual is at different times a considerable advantage and a heavy disadvantage to the development of the divine in man. It is an advantage at first when man is crude and incapable of self-control and self-finding. So the early man, just like a child, is driven by impulses. So is an early man, early stages of evolution, driven by animal impulses and instincts. Is very, very crude and incapable of self-control and self-fulfillment. Animals do not control themselves. It doesn't matter it is public place or private space. Their basic biological instincts, everything finds expression. So is a crude man. When you have not evolved and refined, your basic instincts will find more and more sophisticated, yet same basic instincts are driving in a very crude way. It is an advantage at first when man is crude and incapable of self-control and self-finding. Self-finding, when you're not yet ready to find your own deeper truth and live by that truth. When you're not ready for it, then the social law of the pack is of a great value, great advantage. Because it erects a power other than that of his personal egoism. So the individual is driven by personal ego. And society brings a greater power that overrides this personal ego. It erects a power other than that of his personal egoism, through which the egoism may be induced or compelled to moderate its savage demands. Savage demands. So there is an animal in man, and it has its demands. These demands are compelled to obey, compelled to be controlled, compelled to be in harmony with the rest of the collective life by the social law. Because it erects a power other than that of his personal egoism, through which that egoism may be induced or compelled to moderate its savage demands, to discipline its irrational and often violent movements. Many of our individual impulsions, drives are violent. These are controlled by the social law. That's why we have the entire judiciary, police, laws to control the individual's rude, crude, violent nature. But while it is good to control the rude and crude stage and savage stage of development, it becomes a barrier when the soul wants to liberate itself. The individual gets refined and you want to freely explore. Then this becomes a disadvantage. So the discipline, its irrational and often violent movements, and even to lose itself sometimes in a larger and less personal egoism. So the individual ego can lose itself in the larger ego of the collective being. When you identify completely with it, you lose your individual ego, you identify with the larger collective ego, and that is what you will carry as your identity. It has its advantage when a society is primitive and people are having the savage impulses they cannot control. And the whole development of culture and civilization was about refining the animal in you, animal in us. So it is an advantage at first when man is crude and incapable of self-control and self-finding, because it erects a power other than that of his personal egoism, through which the egoism may be induced or compelled to moderate its savage demands, to discipline its irrational and often violent movements, and even to lose itself sometimes in a larger and less personal egoism. It's a disadvantage to the adult spirit. Now, there is a soul that is growing and emerging, becoming an adult. There's an adult spirit for whom this becomes a disadvantage, ready to transcend the human formula because it is an external standard. Because the inner growth comes from within, and there is the external law that is binding you. Therefore, it becomes a disadvantage, because it's an external standard which seeks to impose itself on him from outside. And the condition of his perfection is that he shall grow from within in an increasing freedom. So the condition of that individual growth is that he will grow from within. When the consciousness turns inward and discovers the deeper inner guidance, that's the beginning of the journey of the spirit. But you find the outer social system binding you. He shall grow from within and in an increasing freedom, not by the suppression, but by the transcendence of his perfected individuality. So the individuality is not to be suppressed, but to be transcended. So on one hand, we have to perfect the individuality, then to transcend so that we arrive at true spiritual freedom. But before that, there is this bondage or a binding by the social law, the pack. Not any longer by a law imposed on him that trains and disciplines his members, but by the soul from within, breaking through all previous forms to possess with its light and transmute its members. So there is the light coming from the soul that will transmute its members. All parts of your being, your mind, your vital, your physical, everything gets refined. So the mind itself becomes refined, more and more noble thoughts enters you. Your heart becomes refined, more and more noble emotions enters you. Your vitality gets refined, more and more noble drives and impulsions carry you forward, the divine impulsions. Even your senses gets refined, body gets refined. So there is a natural refinement that comes with the emergence of the soul and its light. This can override everything else, but it has to first face the social cage in which you find yourself in. So it is a disadvantage to the adult spirit ready to transcend the human formula, because it is an external standard which seeks to impose itself on him from outside. The condition of his perfection is that he shall grow from within and in an increasing freedom, not by the suppression but by the transcendence of his perfected individuality, not any longer by a law imposed on him that trains and disciplines his members, but by the soul from within, breaking through all previous forms, and possess with its light and transmute its members. So the soul takes possession of your instruments, the mind, the vital, the physical, and transmute them. That gives you the inner freedom, the inner strength, the inner capacity to break, override the imposition from outside. What was working subconsciously before you become more and more conscious, then you can wisely break it when this light grows and refines. And that's the transition the individual makes. On one hand, we need the social regulatory principles. When our nature is still animal, impulsive, crude, savage. But when we get refined, these will become barriers that are to be overwritten by the growth from within. So with that, we come to the end of this episode. And now I'm keeping episodes shorter. Let's see whether it is of more value to you. Let me know in their feedback. Thank you. See you next week.